Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming on this Wednesday. My name is Craig Pepin. I'm the president of the New England Educational Assessment Network Board, and I'm here to welcome you to the very last webinar series. And the very last webinar in our June series, Rethinking Courses for Remote Engagement and Evidence of Learning. This is, you can see the title there. I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues from Maritime Academy in just a moment, but I just wanted to welcome you, tell you a little bit about what NEAN does and what we might have upcoming events that might interest you. So the New England Educational Assessment Network, we are celebrating our 25th year this year, one of the oldest regional assessment networks in the country. We are here for promoting and helping people develop in all things assessment related, classroom assessment, institutional assessment in higher education. We publish a journal, the Journal of Assessment and Institutional Effectiveness. We also hold a number of events, and obviously a lot of those events have had to change character. We just decided last week that the annual Fall Forum, which is probably our biggest event, one-day conference, we're going to take that online. We're going to keep the same dates, more or less, November 5th through 6th. First Friday in November is always when we do it. But that is going to be online. Look for a call for proposals coming out for that shortly with different formats. And we're pretty excited about what we might be able to do now with that. This is the last in this particular series, but we're looking ahead to August, and we're organizing another series of webinars, this time looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how it relates to assessment and how assessment can further those goals at your institution. So keep an eye out for that announcement, particularly timely, as I'm sure you can imagine. One final brief housekeeping note before we start, and I turn it over to the Mass Maritime folks. We've asked that you remain muted for the presentation. There should be time at the end for question and answer. We do very much welcome you to put questions in the chat box as we go, and the presenters will do their best to either answer them in the normal flow of the presentation, or if it looks like it'd be better to sort of take that at the end, collate them, and then start with those once we get to the end of the formal presentation. And once we get into the presentation, I think that's also an option to perhaps unmute your microphone. We'll see how it goes, but start with the chat box, please, and we'll see how it goes at the end. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Marlene Clapp at Mass Maritime Academy, and she and her colleagues are going to introduce themselves. Thanks.
Thanks, Craig. Good morning, everyone. I'm Marlene Clapp, the Director of Institutional Effectiveness at Massachusetts Maritime Academy, or MMA for short. And welcome to our webinar, Assignments that Promote Academic Integrity in Online Environments. Glad that you could join us this morning. Now, MMA, like many institutions out there, probably including your own, has an honor code. And this is one of the tools that we use to promote academic integrity amongst our cadets. But as probably many of us know, this semester in particular was rather challenging with the rush to go to remote teaching and learning. And we encountered a lot of issues with academic integrity. So this begs the question, what other tools were available to us or are available to us to promote academic integrity amongst our students? Now, there are technological tools, and MMA did implement one of those tools, that Respondus Monitor and Browser Lockdown, this semester. But today we'd like to talk about another tool in our toolkit, or tool belt, which is robust assignment design. And this applies whether or not we're in an online teaching and learning environment, or face-to-face, or blended. And today we're particularly going to focus on assignments that deal with real-world applications that encourage our students to challenge them, actually, to demonstrate their learning and their competency and take responsibility for their learning. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to my colleagues, Catherine Gildae, who's Associate in the Office of Institutional Effectiveness. And later we'll also hear from Jenna Morton-Aiken, who's Assistant Professor of Humanities and the Writing Program Administrator at MMA. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Catherine, and as Marlene said, I'm the Institutional Effectiveness Associate at Mass Maritime. And in terms of helping understand my background for here too, I'll also mention that I have a number of years of teaching. I'll let you do the math on this, but I started teaching in the college classroom in 2001, and I've been teaching online since 2007. So a lot of what I bring to this is sort of thinking about how this applies regardless of what our classrooms look like. These days, a lot of those are online. We're primarily going to focus on two things today. The first part is my piece, which is kind of looking at what we know about cheating, why students do it, why all of us might do it, and thinking really intentionally about how we might design assignments around cheating. And then the second piece, as Marlene mentioned, two of our faculty colleagues, one in real time and one pre-recorded, will join us and give some examples of how it is that they put this design practice into their assignments in their own classrooms. So cheating. In 2013, there was an article in the Boston Globe, and it was really in response to a huge cheating scandal at Harvard University. And one of the things that they mentioned in there is that about 75% of students will admit to having cheated on at least one assignment ever. And if you know anything about self-report data, of course, that number is likely higher than what people have even admitted to. More than likely, they've cheated on more than one thing. The percent of people who've cheated is likely higher than that 75%. And I think one of the most striking things about this number isn't just the percent that it's 75%, but it's also that that number has remained fairly stable since 1963, when we started asking this question about how often students cheat and how frequently students cheat. So the thing about it starting in 1963 and staying relatively stable is it really points this question of why people cheat, instead of focusing, as maybe some people are inclined to do, with, okay, now we're online, more people might be cheating. I think it's really helpful to think about the fact that we have academic integrity policies in place. We have harsh penalties many places, including where we are. We have certainly more technology at our fingers to make cheating easier, or at least to detect cheating. But we still have that 75% number that we're looking at. And so one of the things in thinking about how it is that we create designs is thinking about what are the conditions under which people are actually not willing to cheat. Because under the right conditions, most people are willing to cheat. And so in preparing for this, I went to the experts. James Lang wrote a fantastic book called Cheating Lessons. It came out several years ago, so many of you have probably read it. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. He also had a series that was run in a number of publications kind of looking at this question. It comes back to this idea that most people are willing to cheat at least a little bit under the right conditions. That's fairly bad news. The good side of that is that if we focus on the environment, the pieces that we can control, including assignment design, and then we employ those with other tools, we can change those conditions. So under the right conditions, most people are unwilling to cheat, even a little bit. So in thinking about why it is that we cheat, there's really three things that come up over and over again. The first of them is the focus on extrinsic motivation. So these are things like grades and even praise. And the thing about these types of extrinsic motivators is that I think we play into them quite frequently, right? We talk about how many people got which grade. We talk about what it is that students might want to do if they want to earn an A in our course. And so we can change the script on that. The circumstances under which a lot of people cheat that are focused on grades often are things that look a lot like our large introductory gatekeeping courses. And that really ties into the second piece of why we cheat. So first is the focus on extrinsic, and then the second is when course material seems irrelevant. So I mentioned that I teach, what I often teach is sociology for people who don't want to learn sociology. I teach sociology for people who are in business, leadership, management courses at Northeastern in the College of Professional Studies. And then I've also taught the introductory level courses that are required for students along the way. So one of my responsibilities in the classroom becomes helping them see that the course and the course material is relevant to their lives. When students don't feel like things are relevant, and also when they've kind of feel like they're anonymous, it becomes much easier to cheat because it's seen as unimportant. They'll pay better attention. And we know that students are less likely to cheat in their advanced courses. They're further in, they see it as very relevant to what they want to do when they finish. The third really pressing reason why people would consider and do cheat has to do with the pressure that we feel. So high stakes exams, infrequent assessments, maybe a course with just a midterm and a final, gatekeeping courses where students, they have to pass the course or they can't get on, the large courses where they have to. And then of course, if you add in the situation we're in now with COVID, where we have students who might be working, they might have pressures from family members who are sick, they're taken away from campus if they were on campus, their technology might be problematic, they might be sharing computers, for example. And so we have all this extra stress going on. So it's kind of the perfect storm. So, you know, at the end of this, one of the things I kept coming back to is when we have these high enrollment, these gatekeeping courses, these lower level courses, it's the perfect opportunity to cheat, but it doesn't have to be. So there's some great ways that we can kind of design around that. I think the big takeaway in terms of the why is really focused on the fact that the more pressure a student feels on any individual exam or assignment, the more likely they are to cheat. So every time we have the opportunity to lower that a little bit and alleviate the pressure in how we're designing assignments, the better chance we have of having them do authentic work. So there are these 5 pillars that are really central to designing for academic integrity. And of course, the first one is the biggest hurdle and the biggest challenge. It takes the most time. But I got ahead of myself. All 5 of these focus around the idea that people really learn best when they're trying to answer some kind of a question or solve some kind of authentic challenge that matters to them. All right, so here we go. Now we have the 5. So the first of them focuses on intrinsic motivation. And this is the hardest to do, but it's also the most important in many ways. And the way that we build intrinsic motivation is by focusing on the challenge or the question or the problem that matters to students. So it's not necessarily something that we figured out when we were an undergrad or a grad student, and so we have the answer and we just want them to find the same answer we already know. It really is about tapping into questions that matter to them, whether it's sort of the meaning of life type of questions or an authentic challenge that people are trying to solve in the world today. So it becomes relevant. And this connects them to some kinds of motivations that are far beyond whatever grade they might earn in the course. And it kind of gets them thinking along the path of a scholar in many ways. The second piece is when we start to move from learning for performance towards learning for mastery. And my favorite example of this comes actually in the analogy to the book or the movie, The Hunger Games. I have a teenager who's very into this. And in The Hunger Games, the central character is Katniss. I'm not giving away the plot, don't worry. But the central character is Katniss Everdeen. And she's selected as a tribute. So she has to go and she goes to this training. And right before they go into the arena where they will all fight to the death, quite literally, they're given the opportunity to demonstrate to a group of panelists as well as to the people watching out in the world how it is that they plan to survive out there. And so Katniss does a very impressive some kind of action with the bow and arrow. She's able to demonstrate how skillful she is with this. If she'd used a different tool, she would have failed miserably. She would have had no people sponsor her or be interested in her performance. But by being able to select the right tool to demonstrate that she was likely a contender, she's able to actually demonstrate that mastery, and she's engaged in it because it's something that she had a chance to succeed at. The third piece is one that I imagine that we've all heard a million times, which is to use frequent low stakes assessment. The reason why this is so important is that it accomplishes 2 things. One of them is it takes the pressure off. There'll be a lot of opportunities to demonstrate the mastery. You don't walk in and you have to do everything in 1 or even 2 chances. You have a lot of time along the way to keep practicing, to get better at the assessment itself, and also to keep demonstrating your learning. And then the second is it taps into retrieval practice, which all of the people who are very talented in this area tell us the more we pull things out of our memory and then we use them, the more likely we are to remember them and bring them out when we need them. So both by doing things that are frequent, which taps into the retrieval practice, and low stakes, which taps into the decreasing the pressure, we can reduce the likelihood, again, that people will cheat. The fourth pillar looks at self-efficacy. And this is the idea of getting students to see not only that they can succeed, but that they're able to succeed in the course. So they set for themselves a reasonable goal. They see from the start of an assignment or of the course itself what the outcome can be. They know what's possible, and it's a reasonable goal for them. And so this is where we get to convey to students what it takes for them to be successful. And then it also builds their metacognitive skills. We know that students are not very good at metacognition. Many students overestimate their own abilities, how much they remember. I studied for an hour for this test. I don't know why I didn't do better on it. I worked really hard on that project. I don't know why I didn't get an A. And so helping them build those metacognitive skills helps them have basically a deeper understanding of their own educational process. And they also see things as more fair. They understand how they'll be graded, they understand what's expected of them, and so they build that all along. And then the final one really taps into their sense of professionalism. And this is where almost every professional organization, certainly ASA, which is the one that I'm part of, they have some kind of statement on ethics. And so we can teach our students and reinforce and remind them frequently that they're developing a habit of integrity when they're in these courses. These are ethical expectations that will stay with them as they enter into their professions, whether it's the one that aligns with whatever discipline we're teaching in or whatever discipline they'll be going into. So these are those 5 pillars. And this is the theory part, right? So how do you actually put this into practice is I think the much more interesting and exciting piece. And so I feel fortunate that we have 2 examples. Jenna's actually going to go first and talk about how she's put some of these into practice with a technical writing exercise, right? Series of exercises. She'll explain. Anyway, thanks, Jenna.
Thanks, Catherine. So I'm going to talk about creating challenging and engaging assessments in a technical writing class. And I'm going to talk first a bit about how the course design and the assessments worked in general when we were face-to-face. Then I'm going to talk about how I did a quick pivot, as most of us did, to make sure we were still getting through what we needed to once we were teaching online. So I'm going to talk about my course design here as well, because I find that course design is directly tied to assessment. Because then assessment is actually something that's embedded throughout the class. It's not just kind of this external, artificial, really stressful moments for students where it becomes part of the process. So that's why I'm going to talk about those things together. I'm also going to talk about them together because in my experience, when you design a creative and active learning environment, you tap into so many of the elements Catherine was just describing, especially the intrinsic motivation. So it gives them both the desire not to cheat because they're seeing the value for themselves, but also makes it harder for them to cheat because when they have agency and they're making decisions throughout the course, they really end up in a choose your own adventure scenario. So by the time they get further down the line, it's much more difficult to cheat in any way. And hopefully they're also invested in the class. So I'm going to talk about this course design in 4 elements. Because for me, course design and assessment design is just like writing. It's situated, it is messy, and is a recursive process. So even though slide makes it look like it's a linear process, it's not. All of these things feed into each other all the way along, but I wanted to break it down in terms of these 4 separate aspects that I really look at when I'm designing a course. So the first thing is the local context. I've taught at a number of schools, as many of you probably have, and the students are different everywhere. The students at Maritime, I love them. They're bright, they're amazing, they're funny. They're very driven. They are not at all interested in humanities, and they are definitely not interested in writing. So I become one of those gatekeeping courses from them. When they walk in, they don't know why they're in my class. It's required for some of our engineers. Others take it just to fulfill a requirement. So I need to understand and respect the fact that they are very good at what they do. They've probably had some poor experiences with writing practice and possibly writing instruction in the past. And so I need to respect that and meet them where they are and create ways that it's active and learning engagement for them so that they can find their own way into writing. And that sometimes happens in contrast to who we are. So I have a PhD in English, specializing in rhetoric and composition. I love writing. I love the teaching of writing. I study the teaching of writing. So I am perhaps not a polar opposite, but I don't sit where they sit in terms of my understanding of writing. I did, however, work in business before coming back to academia, so I can talk about how these things work in real life, why these genres and ways of moving as a professional through life is important. And so that gets us to that third element, is what do they need and how can I provide that for them? It's not about what they want. They want not to have to take my class, or if they have to take it, they want to not have to work hard. But this class is not arbitrary. They have to take technical writing because that's a skill they'll need to be able to have once they are professionals in the world. So how do I create a classroom and assessment activities that reinforce that and feed into it all the way along? So next, to get to the outcomes and takeaways. For me, there are a number of things I want to do in a technical writing classroom that have to do specifically with technical writing. But actually, mostly, I want to position them as writers who are confident and competent. And so that means I have two things I really want them to walk away with. One is an understanding of the rhetorical situation, meaning anytime we communicate, we effectively have an audience, a purpose, and there's context around it. There are things we need to think about in terms of genre and tone and language, even design elements, especially when we get into technical writing. So I want them to walk away with that. And I also want them to understand writing as a process. And writing is a horrible, messy, difficult process that we all struggle with, even those of us who teach writing. And so they understand that there's drafting, there's collaborating, getting feedback and giving feedback, and then revising. And that is not only part of their classroom life, but will also be part of their professional experience. So what I want to do in my classroom then is to enable them to do the things. For Mass Maritime students, they are very hands-on. They came because they want to work on things. And so what I can do for them is I find they're at their best when they can break it, fix it, make it better. So I wanted to figure out how I could help them break technical writing and fix it again. And so that's where I came to the idea of actually putting them in their own simulation of a technical writing company. So this is where students start to choose their own adventure. They name this company the Innovative Communication Solutions Organization. They designed branding, and they wrote both the mission statement and the slogan. So from this point forward, they really get to experience writing in a professional environment. It's not just it's pretend simulation, but in theory, it's not anything artificial. These are really writing environments they may encounter later in life. But I don't start here right off the bat. So I want to go next to the next slide, which is about course structure. So the first thing I do is when they come into my class, and a number of them admit later they were very angry to be in my classroom, is I want to start with where they are as individuals. So we start talking about technical writing, they do some reading, they do journals where they respond to the writing. I call them work journals because they tell me what they took away from the reading and how they're going to use it going forward. I don't want a summary, and so already I'm starting to put that on them. What are their valuable takeaways from this? The next thing we move to is the job application packet. So they choose any job they would actually want to apply for, they annotate it, and so the job ad, they write a cover letter and a resume. So right off the bat, I have established my credibility. I'm valuing who they are, where they want to go in life, and hopefully I'm tapping into that intrinsic motivation and self-efficacy, right? You can write a cover letter. It's hard and it's messy and annoying, but you can do it. So we start off there and we establish what the classroom is like. And so then I start to see a shift then to how students engage with the materials. But then I transition into the teamwork where they're working collaboratively. So they go through a number of assignments here. They write all 5 of these first as drafts. They go through peer review and a platform called Eli Review, which I'll talk about more later. And so they're now having to collaborate on these things. And group work is hard. It's always hard. But again, framing it as something they will have to do as professionals in the classroom means that they start to move through these things in meaningful ways. And I try and draw in elements from their real life. The lab report, for example, I use the model from their actual strengths and materials lab, and we bring that into the classroom, and that's then what we write. Well, even though we're talking about this pretend technical writing company we're in. So they do that for the majority of the class. And then at the end, we transition to the final projects. And so that's then where we're getting into things like the group portfolio. They have to revise all together. They're continuing to do their work journals about the group work and how the revision is going. And they do an individual portfolio and a presentation. So we're really moving through now, not only what they've accomplished, but reflecting on how they have accomplished it. And that's going to take to our next slide, where I start to talk about reflection and metacognition. So as Catherine said, they're not always good at it. So I figure I should give them an opportunity to practice it. So this slide starts off with those reading work journals that I talked about, and it moves up through the final portfolio. And so as they move up the steps, these things increase in complexity, but they also, along that orange bar on the bottom, move through from reflecting, just talking about what's going on, to really metacognition, articulating what the change is, why it happened, what their choices were, and why they made the choices they made specifically. So especially once we get to the poster project, which is, it looks like an academic poster, ask them to put something up as we would at a conference, and they present that out to their peers. And then the final portfolio is something that I see, and I get to see kind of their full journey. And because they've been able to invest all the way along, those are actually really meaningful projects. They're really interesting. And as is important to our session today, they're very difficult to cheat on, because I've been seeing their writing and their voices and their participation all the way along. So I'll go to the next slide in terms of how this breaks down in terms of points of assessment. So we have two groups here of low stakes work versus high stakes, and of individual work versus group work. So these things basically are equally distributed in terms of the low stakes in terms of frequency. They have low frequency all the way along, but in terms of grade weight as well. So as long as students kind of are working towards all of these things, they won't fail and they do a poor job on the poster or something else. So there's this frequent low stakes assessment that then builds their confidence as well as their competence when they get to those final portfolios. So there are a number of different things there. You'll see they go through peer review at every level. So, and that happens again when we get to the high stakes as well. They go through peer review again there. And so students are able to be reinforced for what they're doing, their contributions, both at the low stakes, and by the time they get to the high stakes, a number of them comment that it really wasn't as bad as they expected it to be, and they're able then to talk meaningfully about their work. So how does some of this translate to real life? And so what the two next examples are about what we did face-to-face, and then I'm gonna talk about the pivot to online. So first, it builds a sense of community. These are my students. This is from one of our technical writing classes. When I launch a teamwork, I want them to bond as a team. And so I give them something silly, which is to go take 3 selfies. Their first prompt is to be intimidating as cadets at Maritime. Second one in the middle is to be welcoming, like they are on a brochure for prospective students. And the final one is to be silly. And so they have a lot of fun with it. They kind of think I've lost my mind, but they bond as a group. And we start to build a sense of community that is fun, and it's kind of zany, and it's thinking outside the box. And so I'm doing 2 things there. One is I'm disrupting their sense of what a writing classroom was like already, and we're already setting it up to be a hands-on thing where they're working together and they're really problem solving here. So we build community. And so we also then, I feel like because they're in this community and they get this sense of each other and they're able to feel free and funny, they really get to a sense of growth. So the next slide is an example of a final poster presentation one of my students did. And so the prompt for this is to demonstrate your growth as a writer. And so she loves Tom Brady. So she described herself as before the class as Tom Brady when he was no one. Beginning, of his career, no one had expectations for him. And that was how she felt about writing and technical writing in particular. So then in the middle, she talks about what I learned, and she compares that to Tom Brady's training program, and that this course has prepared her for the things she needs, and she's strengthened in all the ways that matter. And so then that last one is me now, and she compares herself to Tom Brady at the top of his career, 5 Super Bowl rings. And down at the bottom, she's listed her 5 takeaways that equate to his rings. And I mentioned earlier the rhetorical situation. You see it shows up twice here, which I feel like really drives home the fact that, yes, she understood it. It's going to be something she takes with her going forward. So all of this worked really well in person. And then COVID-19 happened. And so like all of you, we had the emergency pivot to online. Because of our strange semester schedule, we had 2 weeks in the classroom before we were sent home. So we had 2 weeks together. We got to talk about some technical writing stuff, and then we had a week to prep. And so I'm going to talk now about how I made all of this work and transition, because as you can tell, it's a lot of hands-on communication, classroom, face-to-face, joking, and so I had a struggle. And so, I'm going to talk about the pivot. So I've taught online before, but as I imagine you understand, there's a difference between planning to teach online and suddenly going online. And so when I suddenly was going online, I wanted to make sure I took these 4 things with me, even though they looked different now. So in terms of local context, I have my same students, but they are now angry, they are scared, and they are stressed. So one of my new elements of context is do no harm. Change only what you have to change and try not to make it worse for them. The outcomes and takeaways are still relevant. If there is any silver lining for me, it's that technical writing is now around my students all of the time. They are seeing instructions happen in real life. They're seeing recommendations out of the CDC. So how can I pick it up and reposition it around reality? The course structure. How do I do minimal changes? I know I'm going to have to change my group work structure because, as Catherine said, a lot of them were working or were sharing laptops. I tried one synchronous session, and it didn't really take. So I then created everything. I moved it to a task list, and I set up my class time as office hours so students could come and get what they needed during that time. They still had access to me, but it wasn't required. And finally, the reflection and metacognition. Our students are struggling, and I wanted to recognize that. So in addition to talking about the content, I also want to be open to talking about how they're coping. How can we expand this now to not just be about technical writing classroom, but about our content, our practice, and who we are as humans in the world. So my secret ingredient that I already had is Eli Review. If you don't know about it, it's an amazing peer review platform. There is a subscription for it. You can either for students or if you can get an institutional subscription. It's designed by folks who specialize in writing studies, and it allows a guided sequence where students are able to peer review based on your own criteria, and they really are able to see that drafting, the feedback, and then the revision aspect of it. I was already using this in my classes, but it really came in handy then when all of a sudden all we could do was online. So I'm going to show you again a quick view of what it looked like before. So this is the same slide you saw before. I have individual work, teamwork, and then the final things. So when we went online, I focused first on the individual work. As I said, we were in for 2 weeks, so I could keep a lot of this. So I extended the discussions. Instead of being in the classroom now, they're on discussion boards. And I'm asking them to bring in much more of real world examples rather than just looking at what's in the textbook. The journals now are all going to be on content and on coping because they're humans and this is where they are. So I also, usually in my classroom, I'm more formal. But when I'm talking now with my students in this stressful time, I'm using memes. I'm using them as examples of technical communication, of communication in general, but also as a bonding experience. And then I use Eli Review, and then also a bit of grace for everyone involved. So there were recommendations on when to complete things, not deadlines. So then we had the shift to group work. And this was the biggest change I made here. And teaching online again, however that might happen in the future, I will continue to do the group work and build the technical company in the future. This time was different. This time was emergency teaching. So I made it optional. I sent them a survey. I asked them how they wanted to work. In the end, we had a group where they were kind of more of a cohort, but they were not producing documents together. A group that was working asynchronously, so they would correspond. There were 3 of those. And then there was one group that was actually working in real time. Instead of the idea of a technical company, we were now just all trying to survive the semester together. So the proposal became about how they were going to talk to one another. The lab report became about how they could actually revise an existing lab report to make it meet these specifications. The instructions were about how to write a lab report when you weren't going to be in the class altogether. So I tried to really pivot again to where they are to make it applicable to them. We continue working with all these other elements as well. And then the final presentation. So I cut the group portfolio. It felt like a lot of work given that they were working, from a distance. They kept working on those work journals. The portfolio stayed the same. And the biggest change here was the individual poster. So I gave them the option of it. But again, I want to recognize their circumstances. So I gave them a number of options. They could do anything that showed me how they've grown as a technical writer. It could be a TikTok video, it could be interpretive dance, it could do a poster. One of my recommendations that I was surprised so many of them took me up on was a letter to yourself about why it was worth coming to this class in this time of crisis. And a lot of them wrote really amazing, engaging letters, basically telling their former selves off for dismissing the class and that they wish they had invested more in this. In part because a number of them, and this happens every semester, they get jobs out of the cover letters that they write for the course. And so you know, they have a chance now to reflect on their growth, on their professional development, and their professional accomplishments. So this wasn't an expected semester, and I did my best, as we all did. But I have one quote I want to share from a student in his or her final portfolio, who said, I think I grew a lot when I look back and see how I wrote in the past compared to how I write now. I'm very happy you were my instructor. You challenged me more than you know, and I came out a better person because of it. Thank you. And so I feel like with feedback like that, you know, they, even if they don't know the rhetorical situation, they're thinking, they're reading, they're engaging with the world around them. And so, so the assessment, the feedback I got from the students and the engagement with those final portfolios really indicated to me that face-to-face or online, we can really design a rich classroom where students are able to engage and enjoy each other and themselves. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jenna.
Thanks, Jenna. So Catherine's going to queue up a segment from Paul Szwed, who's chair and professor in our International Maritime Business Department. And unfortunately, Paul had a conflict. He was presenting at another conference as well this morning. So he couldn't be with us personally, but he was kind enough to record his portion of the session for us. While we're queuing up, there was a question, Jenna, I know you have some thoughts on this if you have a chance to address it really quickly. In terms of trying to translate some of this to large class sections, are there tips for working with large numbers to make grading and feedback manageable?
That is one of the advantages of Eli Review, is that you train students to be reviewers for each other. So you can see what's going on. And because in Eli Review, you also train them to give feedback on the feedback, you can get, you know, a larger, an idea of what's happening. Other ways depends on what it is. You can have little takeaways in terms of kind of smaller bits of writing. So, or whatever it is, you know, what are the exit tickets, things like that. So it doesn't have to be a huge thing. I find that for group work, it actually, it works out really well because then you just have fewer pieces of things to grade. So for the group work, I definitely have the writing responses that that I need to respond to every time. I scan those. They're a page or 2 pages, and I just kind of look for how things are going. I don't grade them. It's a complete non-complete exercise. Because it's low stakes, it's also low stakes on my end, so it means I can scan through those much more quickly. Our classes tend to be around 20, 22 people, so we are on the smaller scale. I have done this on a larger scale. It is a big ask. And so I would be happy to talk more about kind of how to translate that later.
Thank you.
Hello, Paul Szwed here. Happy June, everyone, and hope everyone is doing well in these final weeks of a crazy semester. Unfortunately, I will not be able to attend the faculty assessment workshop on Monday, so I thought I'd share a short video about some assignments I've designed to promote academic integrity. I think for me, there are 2 ways that I've used to achieve this goal. First is to elevate the level of thinking, and second is to make it personal. So part of where I'm coming from on this is a faculty conversation I believe we had back in May on curation. And by the way, I hope you enjoyed that musical interlude. And in that faculty conversation, one of the resources was a blog by Jennifer Gonzalez on curation, and her thought was how to boost higher order thinking. I'm going to scroll down. It talks through some of the theory involved in it, Bloom's taxonomy, Danielson's framework. It gives you a description of curation, and here's what she indicates are the benefits. So these are, as you can tell, the 3 highest level of Bloom's taxonomy: understand, analyze, and evaluate. And by curating, and curation is compilation of information, by curating, students actually have to demonstrate some understanding of what they're putting together, do some assessment or understanding or analysis of why they want to include that, and then also some evaluation. They may have to write a little bit about it, etc. I decided to do this in the graduate course I teach on the Waltham campus this year for my supply chain management class. And rather than a typical exam, I told the students that I wanted them to do a curation exercise. And this is the prompt here. There are really two reasons I wanted them to do this. In addition to having them think a little more deeply about what was in the course. And this was towards the end of the course. I wanted them to create an artifact of their learning that they could reference back to in the future. And we used third-party curation tools, so they would always have access to that. Whereas if it was in a Blackboard blog or something, they might lose that as they went ahead. And the other reason was it would give me some insight into what they learned and also what they found most interesting. And using transparent assignment framework, I gave purpose, the skills that'll be used. You can see there review, curate, and summarize. Those are the three things that they're doing in this process. And then step-by-step tasks. So I wanted them to go back through the course, read through the readings, look at the videos, the links, the comments, take a look at their notes and what they submitted, and then pick the top X, any number, 4, 5, 10, whatever they like, most interesting insights or concepts from the course. And then I wanted them to find an image, an article, a video, a website, or something that captured the essence of that interesting insight or comment. And then I wanted them to summarize that. And I gave them several tools down here. You can see Pearl Trees, Live Binder, Prototype, Learnist, eLink. And I'll show you two of them that I got from students, and I have their permission to share them. This first one is done in Pearl Trees, and it's a tile format that you see in many social media. You would see it in Pinterest or something. In this one, she has 10 tiles. Each tile, she created 2 subtiles, and then an overview. Some of these reference out to external resources, and some reference internal resources. So it's a pretty nice compilation. You know, if you click on this one, you're going to get into a video that talks about CPFR, which means nothing to you probably, but it has to do with supply chain management. And that was, I think, a great example of some of the higher order thinking that went on into it. To compile this, to put some sense into the course, to capture some artifacts, and then to put some meaning onto those artifacts. So this both elevated the thinking, and it was personal because it was what made sense to them. This is another example from another student. I have permission to share this as well. The course is supply chain management. This is a bit of a spoof on supply chain management. I'm always a sucker for a good cartoon. In this one, she had 5. This is one of the slides or frameworks from the course, and she talked about why that was important to her. Here's a video. Again, this is one of the videos from the course. And then she talked about why that was important. This is an external article, one that I don't think read, but one that she pulled in from her own. This bill of lading I know comes from elsewhere. So you get an example, and this was done on eLink, which is a slightly different format, but I wanted to give the students some options. Some students, when they didn't want to use social media or these types of online references, resources, they did this in a PowerPoint format, which is fine, but I wanted them to have it external. So that's one example. Elevate the thinking and also make it personal. Another example I've used, and this was last year in my project management class with the undergraduates, at the end of the course I decided I wanted them, and it's a project management, one of the phases of project management, at the very end, phase 5, that's project closeout. And part of a project closeout is that you capture lessons learned, you summarize what you did. So I wanted them to treat their learning and the course like a project, and I asked them to do this post-mortem reflection paper, which is a typical thing you would do in project management. So we were emphasizing some of the practical skills you learn in project management to apply it onto the course. Again, I'm using a transparent assignment format, and so I gave them 3 question prompts for 4 of the different knowledge areas of the course. I gave them a rubric of what their response, how it would be graded, and then I also gave them some bonus questions. I gave them, I don't know, it looks like 12.5 more questions that they could answer. And again, this elevates the thinking because they have to think about their thinking, think about their learning. So it's a bit of metacognition, if you will. I wasn't looking for them to provide back facts and tools and techniques from the course. I was asking them to reflect on what they learned and what they thought was effective within the course. So we elevated the thinking, and it's also personal because each student is going to have a different response. And by using those 2 ideas, I think it is very hard, or it would be very hard for students to plagiarize or copy or do any of the other various anti-integrity things that we've seen. So I just wanted to share those 2 ideas with you. If you have any questions or would like to talk about it, I welcome you reaching out to me. I'm more than willing to share these assignments with you if you want to take a look at them in a greater detail. But for now, let's leave it there and have a good workshop.
So thank you, Paul, for sharing. We'll circle back to him after the meeting, but glad that he could at least record that for us. And now we'd like to open up to some Q&A. If you'd like to post those in the chat. I know some of you have been posting questions as we go along, and there were some questions, some comments about the topic we started addressing related to integrating some of what we've discussed with larger class section sizes. So I know Jenna has some more thoughts on that, and I'll turn that over to her while we see what other questions come in. Thank you.
Thanks, Marlene. I can talk more about that, but I also know actually Catherine has a couple of great examples. So I want to make sure I give her the floor in this one.
You caught me off guard.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. I was trying to catch up on the chat. So in terms of thinking about sort of scaling it to larger classes and different modalities and everything, one of the things I think that I've experienced in terms of the class sizes I've taught in person and online is that almost all of this is scalable. It really depends on how you design it. So for example, I have a very full class that I'm teaching this spring. And so I broke my students into groups using the Blackboard function. And so, some of their discussion and reflection posts get done where they're only talking to 4 other people in the group, just as they would do in a large class. And then they might summarize, some weeks they have to summarize, okay, what did your group come up with? Like, where did you personally start? What did your group do? And how has your thinking shifted as a result? So they do become scalable. And then I think one of the other things is I still do group projects regardless of the size of the class. It's just what the nature of those looks like. And so for an online class, thankfully right now, most of mine are capped at 35, but I've done 120, and group projects are overwhelming there, except that you can say you're responsible to peer review 4 of them. And group projects for me mean that instead of grading 120, term papers or writing assignments, I'm grading, it's still a lot, but I'm grading 30 or 40 presentations instead of 120 individual assignments. So there is some work to do when you scale these types of assignments, all of that checking in. I use the peer review function that's in Blackboard, both through Turnitin, because that's what we have at Northeastern, but also just the standard peer review that's built in as a way for students to get feedback quickly, and they're getting it from their peers. I build the rubric in so that they're ticking off the same things I'm looking for. And I do things, one of my favorite prompts, and it kills my students, but I say, how did they do on this mark on the first one? So did they answer part 1 very well? Yes, they always say, yes, they did. They give them a 5 out of 5. And then I say, great, restate what they said. And then they kind of fumble through and they have to write a minimum of 50 words to restate what the person answered part one in. So there are ways to get them engaged in that, like I said, they scale up. And then that becomes very much like what Jenna does with the review function. Did they do it or did they not? So yes, they did peer review. They did do 50 words per each of those 3 segments and a 100-word summary. So they just wrote 250 words in their peer review. And I just check off that they did it. So those are some of the ways that I scale, and it works quite well online. In fact, I end up using some of those tools in person when I teach larger classes now because they work so well in that online environment. Now I'll punt it back over to Jenna though.
Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, no, I agree with that. And part of the other thing I want to mention is that it's probably apparent by now, but I do very little lecturing in the class, and most of it is interacting. So time when we shifted to online, it meant that time I might have spent preparing lectures. Instead, I was, creating tasks and supporting materials to go with tasks. But it meant that I was feeding back to what they were doing kind of on a regular basis. So it also depends a lot on kind of what your focus is in the classroom already, how you do that. Paula had some great examples in the chat, and I think one of them was the fact that you don't have to give everyone feedback on every round of things or respond to everything. So you can adopt kind of a hybrid contract grading model, a flipped classroom model, and see what works for you. When you ask them to write more, they usually get better. It's practice. And so it doesn't have to just be writing, right? Even if they're writing about, somebody asked about math, write about math. Why is this applicable? How is it helping them? What are their questions about it? The more you ask students to articulate, it's a sheer numbers game in my experience. The more you ask them to do it, the better they're going to get at it. And then you can really find the students who need assistance and give them particular feedback there. But in general, it can become did they do the 250 words or whatever it is? And once they have, you can shift forward from there.
Thank you. So there's been some questions, some discussion in the chat about applications for mathematics courses in particular. I don't know if either of you or anyone in the audience here has some additional thoughts on that topic.
Just from my field, there's a lot of research on a program called Writing to Learn. And the idea is that asking students to explain their process and their learning. So you can kind of pair any discipline with again, this kind of report out, and that assists with things. But that's kind of, as much as I want to throw my hat in the ring at the moment.
I would tag onto that. So one of the great things I get to do at MMA is I get to work with our faculty. And we're so heavily STEM focused that I get to find out what people are doing. And I know some of our faculty who teach in the algebra trig and then calculus sequence, for example. It's not peer review, but they have students look at each other's problems. They have students work together in teams, and so they're kind of collectively tasked with, make your own attempt, figure out what you need to problem solve here, and then they can pop into, say, a group of people. I know someone who's doing this through Blackboard Collaborate, for example, hopping into a group of students as opposed to going to each one individually. They were able to see, 4 or 5 students at a time, troubleshoot what that particular group hadn't figured out on their own yet, and move them to the next step. And then also in terms of some of the authentic things, in terms of trying to create some kind of an assessment or assignment that ties to real world, certainly engineering and math, in terms of the design and the applicability, they lend themselves so well to this. And engineering design, though I'm not an engineer, is all about design and redesign and continuing to refine that process. So again, the peer feedback and kind of connecting it to real world, again, it just ties in really nicely. But a lot of it comes into that, how do we design assignments around those principles so that they're engaged in it? So we're not asking them to reinvent something that's there, but to solve a problem that currently exists, for example. So one of the examples that Lang mentions actually is about a physics course at MIT where there was a lot of cheating going on, and they actually converted it over to a studio model for that very reason, so that the students were doing authentic work right there in the classroom, and sort of changed the dynamic. It wasn't a flipped classroom. They did kind of a micro lecture, and then they would apply it right away. And they were able to troubleshoot, and because people were in groups, even though it was a large class, they could visit with each individual group and kind of see how they were strategizing and solving those problems. So I think it does translate, even though those are not the things I teach.
And just to offer an example from my perspective, I have taught as an adjunct different classes. I most recently business computing for our international maritime business students. So this is primarily Excel for business majors, highly technical. Mostly I had homework assignments, we did have tests, but the project that worked the best and that had the least amount of cheating was a group project where students, I gave them kind of options as to choose a data set, and they chose a data set. They worked in teams, applying what they learned throughout the semester. I focused on the different outcome areas that they were supposed to master. Make sure you integrate pivot tables, make sure you integrate these different functions, and they had to use those and work those in with the data set that they had selected. So there was definitely no cheating on that assignment. They were more engaged. Definitely some things I could have done to tweak the assignment in terms of building more scaffolding and check-ins along the way so that they didn't wait to the last minute. But it was a great assignment, and one that I would continue using because it makes it relevant to them, makes it interesting to them. They have some agency over it, choosing what they want to do and how they want to work with that data set. Anyone else would like to chime in on any thoughts? I know it seems like we've had a couple of folks offering ideas in the chat here. Like a walkthrough explanation video. I know it's something that you've used, Catherine, before in your classes as well. So maybe just a quick show of hands or in the chat. Anyone who's thinking of changing assignments for the fall? Are we all kind of in the same boat here? Yeah. Looks like a lot of thumbs up on that. Great. We hope that what we've shared here today has been helpful as you start thinking about what you're going to do for the fall. And there have been some questions about the resources, if they'll be available. We've been recording the session, so that will be available afterwards. We'll make the PowerPoints available, and we will be able to make some of the assignment examples available as well. And look into saving the chat as well, because there have been a lot of great ideas in the chat too. Craig, any final words before we depart here?
No, just thanks to all of you for a wonderful presentation. This was really great. I came away with a bunch of ideas as well. And so thank you all. And just a reminder that these webinar will be available to anyone who registered, but also NEAN members get access to it even if they did not register. This and many other resources are available with your NEAN membership. And we're currently, if you sign up now, you'll get a membership through the full next year's membership. So that's 17 months of membership for the usual membership price. So head on over to NEAN.org and have a look and consider joining us. And check back again also at NEAN.org for updated information on our upcoming events. So thanks once again to all the presenters. That was excellent. And we're at 11 o'clock, so it seems like the perfect time for us to say goodbye. So thank you, everyone.